Marcel Khalifa here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. We are broadcasting on over 700 stations on Pacifica and NPR and low-power FM and college and community radio stations, on public access TV and PBS TV stations, and both TV satellite networks, Dish Network Channel 9415, Free Speech TV, 9410 Link TV, and on DirecTV Channel 375. And we're video and audio podcasting at democracynow.org, where the full transcripts of the show are also available. Our headlines also available in Spanish for any radio station to take, as almost 200 are. I'm Amy Goodman, as we continue today on the 60th anniversary of the creation of the State of Israel. Today, a debate around the legacy of 1948 and a possibility of a just future for both Israelis and Palestinians. Benny Morris is seen as one of the most important Israeli historians of the 1948 war. From his first book 20 years ago, Morris has documented Israeli atrocities and the expulsion of Palestinians, considered part of a group of so-called revisionist historians who challenge conventional Israeli thinking about 1948. However, unlike his critics to the left, Morris did not consider the expulsions to be part of a systematic Israeli policy of transfer. His latest book, published in March by Yale University Press, is called 1948. A History of the First Arab-Israeli War. He joins us here in our Firehouse studio. We're also joined in California by Saree Makdisi. He's in Los Angeles, professor of English and Comparative Literature at UCLA. His latest book is Palestine Inside Out, an everyday occupation, just out this month. His most recent op-ed in the Los Angeles Times is called Forget the Two-State Solution, Israelis and Palestinians Must Share the Land Equally. We are also joined on the telephone from Brussels by Norman Finkelstein, author of 4 books, including The Holocaust Industry, Image and Reality of the Israel-Palestine Conflict, and Beyond Chutzpah. He was in Brussels addressing a group of parliamentarians around the issue of Palestinians. And our guest remains on the line, Tikva Honed Parnas, who fought in the 1948 war, now is a progressive writer in Israel and critical of what happened in 1948. Benny Morris, welcome to Democracy Now! Explain, from your perspective, from your research, what happened in 1948.
Well, based on a large amount of documentation which I've gone through over the years, several decades in fact, the international community in the wake of the Holocaust voted to establish 2 states in Palestine, to divide the land into a Jewish state and an Arab state. The Jewish side, the Zionists movement, the Jewish Agency executive, accepted the international decision and went about establishing their state. The Palestinian Arabs, backed by the Arab world, rejected the decision and went to war against the Jewish community in Palestine and subsequently against the state which was established half a year later. As a result of this war, some 700,000 Palestinians were displaced from their homes, not really turned into refugees, most of them, because they were moved from one place in Palestine to another. About 1/3 moved out of Palestine and were genuine refugees.
And on what do you base all of this?
Oh, on masses of Israeli, American, United Nations, British documentation. The Arab documentation isn't available. The Arab states, all of them being dictatorships, do not open their archives, but all Western archives, especially the Israeli archives, give a very good picture of what actually happened.
Can you talk about the significance of your finding within the State of Israel? You're basing much of this on Israeli documents, how you broke with convention in Israel.
Yeah, the traditional Zionist narrative about what had happened in '48, especially relating to the refugee problem, was that the refugees had been ordered, instructed, advised by their leaders, by Palestinian leaders or Arab leaders outside the country to flee, and that is why 700,000 left their homes. The documentation gives us a much broader and more nuanced picture of what happened. Most of the people who were displaced fled their homes. A small number number were expelled. Most fled their homes as a result of the war. The fear of battle, the fear of being attacked, the fear of dying. A small number also left because of the economic conditions, and a small number were advised or instructed by their leadership, as in Haifa in April 1948, to leave the country. But it's a mixed bag, with the war itself, the hostilities themselves, and fear of being hurt being the main precipitant to flight.
You have written that the humiliation of the Arabs going back to 1949 is what underlies so much of the hostility today. Lay out what you see as the humiliations.
It's a historic humiliation. It's not a private, personal humiliation. I think the Arab world was brought up, the Islamic Arab world was brought up on tales of power and conquest, dating back to the 7th century and the expansion of Islam and the Arabs out of the Arabian Peninsula and the conquest of the Mediterranean basin, parts of Europe, and so on. And they had a self-image of a powerful people. And what happened in after the Turkish Ottoman conquests in the 15th century and subsequently belittled the Arab world, disempowered it, and then came the European imperial incursions, sometimes conquests in the 19th century, and topping all that came the Zionist influx and the unsuccessful Arab war against it in 1947-48. And this was a humiliation the Arab world could not take. 630,000 Jews had bested 1.2 million Palestinians and 40 million Arabs surrounding that 630,000 strong community. And this humiliation is something which they have never been able to erase, and still, I think, motivates them in large measure in their desire to erase the state of Israel.
How was it that for so many years the Zionist narrative was that there were either no Palestinians, it was an empty land, or the Palestinians left of their own accord?
These are different subjects, but I think the Zionists preferred not to see the 500,000 or so natives who were there as they regarded them at the end of the 19th century, because if they'd sort of looked at them and they'd have seen the problem of what do you do with 500,000 people who don't want you to arrive and settle in what they regarded as their land, this would have knocked out the confidence from the Zionists and undermined their enterprise. It was better to see that to believe that the land was in some way empty. But if you look at the actual Zionist documentation, they did see the Arabs and they knew there was a problem almost from the start. When it comes to the Palestinian most of them so-called refugees or the displaced of 48, look, political movements, peoples like to feel good about themselves and to feel that their cause is just. My belief is the Zionist cause was just, and they had good reasons to believe, to see themselves as good. But every war has its dark side, especially civil wars, which are notably vicious. And 48 also had a dark side, which involved the displacement of 700,000 people and the decision by the Israeli government, and this is the crucial decision. There was never a decision to expel, but there was a decision not to allow back the refugees. And this in some way is a dark side to the 48 war, which was a glorious war of the creation of the State of Israel, the defeat of larger armies, ultimately larger countries by a small and weak community. But they preferred not to look at the dark side.
Saree Makdisi, I wanted to bring you in, professor at UCLA, joining us from Los Angeles. Your response to Benny Morris?
Well, I mean, I think the most interesting thing is the way in which Dr. Morris talks about there being a problem way before 1948, and he's entirely right. When the Zionist movement decided to create a Jewish homeland or a Jewish state in a land that had a largely non-Jewish population at the beginning of the 20th century, there was, in fact, a problem. He's totally right. So the question is, as he puts it in his own work, what do you do with this big population that doesn't want there to be a state that displaces them or ignores them or sidesteps them or overshadows them or whatever? And as his own research shows, and as the research of other historians shows, from at least the mid-1930s on, there's talk of removing the population, and that goes on to this very day in different forms. I mean, for example, there are people in Israel itself, in Israeli politics, to this very day, both within Israel proper and in the occupied territories, who talk about completing the process of transfer, of removal of 1948. And then, as he also says, the other thing is that irrespective of what language one uses, and notice how canny one can be with the use of language. Are they refugees? Are they displaced persons? It doesn't really matter what language one uses. The people who were removed from their homes, that's what matters. And as he says himself in what he just said now, what matters isn't so much that they were removed from their homes, is that they were never allowed back to their homes. So whatever the circumstances of the removals and expulsions of 1948, the more important fact is that was seen as something, as an issue 40 years previously, if not longer before that, and as an issue to be blocked when they wanted to go back to their homes after the fighting stopped. And they've never been allowed to go back, as you know, despite their moral and legal right to do so. That's what this is all about.
Norman Finkelstein, let me bring you into this conversation, author of a number of books on Israel-Palestine. His latest is Beyond Chutzpah, speaking to us from Brussels.
Well, as it happens on the plane ride over here, I read Benny Morris's new book. And what was most surprising to me is that although the documentation remains